Good afternoon, everyone. We're going to start with the final panel discussion of the forum today. My name is Ramon Pacheco Pardo, and I'm a professor at King's College London, and I hold the Korea Chair at the Brussels School of Governance. It is an honor and a pleasure for me to chair this session on cooperation with Europe for Korean unification. We have 5 distinguished speakers, which I will introduce briefly. You have the full bio in the leaflet that has been distributed earlier today. I'll start by thanking the Ministry, Tongilbu, Korea University, Koreode, and also Cambridge University for this invitation to be here at the forum. And I was able to listen to the previous session and the heated discussion that we had on nuclear issues. Now we focus on something that I guess we all hope for, which is eventual Korean unification at some point in the future. So we're going to follow the order that you have in the program in terms of the presentations. Each speaker will have 10 minutes, same as the previous session. I do realize we're starting a bit late as well. And after the initial presentations, we're going to have a Q&A straight with the audience, so you can start preparing your questions. So immediately to my right, I have Professor Park Hyun-chung, who is an emeritus research fellow at the Korea Institute for National Unification. Next to him, we have Antoine Bonda, who is director of the Indo-Pacific Observatory and also the Korea program at the Foundation for Strategic Research. I was mixing bad French with bad English there. Then we have Jim Hoare, who is the currently an honorary research fellow, honorary research associate at SOAS, and he spent 33 years in the Foreign Service, including a stint in Pyongyang in 2001-2002. We also have Niklas Swanstrom, who is director and co-founder of the Institute for Security and Development Policy in Stockholm. And last but not least, in terms of introductions, we have Antonio Fiori, who is a professor of history and institutions of Asia at Bologna University and also has an affiliation with Korea University. So without any further ado, Professor Park, the floor is yours.
Hello, good afternoon. My topic is Korean unification. Those are my topics and the summary of my presentation. And there are 2 articles in the Korean constitution related to unification. And South Korea's traditional unification plan was a stepwise unification through liberal engagement. But the principle of the strategy of liberal engagement has failed. And Kim Jong-un has revived unification by force. And the liberal engagement, the peaceful unification, peaceful stepwise unification through liberal engagement has been relevant during the period of the hegemony of liberal international order. But now the world's order has transitioned to a geopolitical competition. And in this era of geopolitical competition, probably the principles of liberal engagement may not work. And South Korea probably a new imagination to push forward for unification. There are 2 articles in the Constitution. Article 3, the territory of the Republic of Korea shall consist of the Korean Peninsula and its adjacent islands. And Article 4, the Republic of Korea shall seek unification and shall formulate and carry out a policy of peaceful unification based on the free democratic basic order. And these two articles are these two articles form the legal starting points for South Korean governments in dealing with matters of unification and inter-Korean relations. And now I talk to South Korea's official plan for unification. It is called National Community Unification Plan. It is actually a Korean version of American liberal engagement toward China after the Cold War. It was announced by Kim Jong-un administration in 1994. It assumed 3 stages on the way to unification. The first stage is reconciliation and cooperation. Through this first stage, there must be formed mutual trust must be formed between the two Koreas. And then the two Koreas form inter-Korean confederation. And the last stage is advanced and democratic unified Korea. And among the 3 stages, stage 1, the first stage is very important. The formation of mutual trust during the first stage of reconciliation cooperation was essential for whether the unification plan would be ultimately successful. But the liberal engagement, strategy of liberal engagement had failed. The reason why this liberal engagement has failed is the same as why American policy towards China has failed. The main reason is that excessive optimism on the presumed strategic effects of liberal engagement. Deeper engagement would serve to accelerate China's and North Korea's economic liberalization and development. The emerging middle class would challenge the communist dictatorship and promote democratization. Expanding engagement would create vast economic opportunities for the United States and South Korea. Consistent engagement would ultimately transform China and North Korea into full members of a global liberal international order. These are the main assumptions to pursue for liberal engagement towards China and also toward North Korea. But this strategy of liberal engagement has failed. There are 3 factors. The resilience of authoritarianism in China and North Korea. They're entrenched in enmity and revisionism against the Western values and status quo. And their strategic cunning for taking advantage of the Western liberal engagement for their own purposes. And recently, after the inauguration of Kim Jong-un's power, after Kim Jong-un started his regime, Kim Jong-un has revived unification by force. His father, Kim Jong-il, has never openly mentioned unification through military force. But Kim Jong-un revived his plan for unification by force. Soon after his inauguration to power, he reformed North Korea's military to enable it to win a war for the fatherland unification. In general, Kim's declared ambition becomes more grandiose as North Korea advances its nuclear and missile forces. Recently, Kim Jong-un, this is a report by Rodong Sinmun, Korea Works Party organ. Kim Jong-un acquainted himself with the plan of the drill staff, which is aimed at occupying the whole territory of the southern half by repelling the enemy's sudden armed invasion and switching over to all-out counterattack. The phrase, occupying the whole territory of the southern half, never appeared in the past. And from here to where? There is no near-term prospect for a resumption of liberal engagement with North Korea. it would be realistic only after an international shifts of power in favor of the global West, accompanied by meaningful progress in the denuclearization of North Korea. And three countries, South Korea, United States, and Japan, declared the spirit of Camp David. We express support for the goal of ROK's audacious initiative and support a unified Korean Peninsula that is free and at peace. That these three Japan and the United States agreed to support a free and peaceful unification by unification. This is the first time. And South Koreans are searching for a new unification plan. There have been discussions on whether and how to revise the national community unification plan considering the changing perceptions on unification in South Korea and international conditions. And the Ministry of Unification installed the planning committee for unification future in February this year. South Korea-European cooperation. I would only talk about a long-term strategic cooperation. Each party should contribute externally to the restoration of global dominance of the liberal international order, and internally to the consolidation of liberal democratic governance. This is because only under these two conditions, a free and peaceful Korean unification would be made possible. Thank you.
We have 2 minutes left.
Yeah.
2 minutes. Oh, that was it. Oh, sorry. Yeah. I was waiting for the last part. Thank you very much, and thanks for mentioning Europe as well. And now we have 4 Europeans from 4 different European countries who are going to bring our own perspective from this part of the world. So, Antoine, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thanks a lot to the organizer, John, the Ministry of Unification, everyone. I will try to be very, very pragmatic and very down to earth in the discussion on the role that Europe could play with North Korea, or in dealing with North Korea, or in negotiation with North Korea, etc. The first thing is that we might have an opportunity because there is a comprehensive but selective reopening of North Korea after almost 4 years of full lockdown and international lockdown. Of course, the reopening that was symbolized by the joint Sino-Russian visit to the July military parade, the North Korean leader's subsequent visit to Russia in September, is clearly the sign that if even Kim Jong-un can travel abroad, the country is reopening. So we might expect, of course, for the diplomatic network of North Korea to be reshuffled, with a huge human resources problem actually in Pyongyang. That is, you may have the whole diplomatic network to reshuffle and so many diplomats to change actually in the coming few months or coming few years, with some diplomats having been abroad in the same posting for some of them more than 6, 7, 8 years, and the willingness for them to go back to Pyongyang, and the need, of course, to Pyongyang also to reassess in terms of security, etc., the faithfulness, the loyalty of these diplomats, etc. So there's going to be some change abroad in the diplomatic posting of North Korea. On our side, we need to be clear that on the European side, we lost many of our network in the DPRK. All of our NGOs left, the 4 European NGOs left in March 2020. And the other international organization, be it the Red Cross or the UN-affiliated organization, left by the end of December 2020. There were not European network per se or diplomatic network per se, but they were very useful actually to contribute to a better understanding of what was going on the ground in North Korea. Same with, of course, all of our embassies, because all of the EU embassies and posting with the French office closed in 2020. So we lost our network in the PRK. We need to rebuild it. How? It's going to be complicated. On very practical term, we burnt everything we had in the different posting. We burned all of the archive, everything that was on paper, everything we kept in the embassies were destroyed. So we need to kind of start from scratch, and it's going to take some time. With another problem that is we have no trust in what the building have become and with the security of this building. Very pragmatic concept. Second, we lost a lot of know-how. The diplomats that were posted in North Korea have been posted somewhere else. Many who wanted to go to Korea have been posted somewhere else. And you might end up sending in the next few months, if North Korea allow it, diplomats that are not Korea experts or even Asia experts. So there might be a human resources problem on the European side. And last but not least, we lost network in terms of experts because for almost 4 years we had no interaction with North Korean coming from Pyongyang. Many of us had interaction with North Korean being posted in Europe, but not with North Korean coming from Pyongyang with maybe more accurate messaging than the one we can have from the embassies or from the diplomatic posting in Europe. And that's something we saw very clearly. To give you an anecdote, I know we are on record, but a few days after the beginning of the war in Ukraine, North Korean diplomats in Europe had not been briefed with the official narrative that they were supposed to carry on and convey in Europe. So basically, 1 week or 10 days after the war in Ukraine, the North Korean diplomats were completely blind in what they were supposed to tell us. So North Korea is reopening, it's creating an opportunity, but I think we need to be very cautious. First thing is that North Korea will not reopen primarily towards Europe. They have not gained to gain, actually not much actually to gain from Europe, and there might be a very selective reopening and a very selective, I would say, decoupling at the same time. North Korea has an interest in getting, of course, closer to its ally, China, to its partner, Russia. We've seen it a few days ago, but also to some of its key partners in Asia, in the Middle East, and in Africa. Let's talk about Burkina Faso, Syria, Myanmar, etc. These are the countries that North Korea will turn to some form of economic engagement, economic cooperation, etc. They don't expect anything from South Korea due to the current leadership in South Korea, and they don't expect much from Europe. You can talk, and we can talk again about economic engagement from Europe, etc. It's not going to happen. And I think we need to be very honest on that. We've been talking about that for many years. We stopped economic engagement with North Korea even before the European sanctions, economic sanctions in North Korea. So the idea that European companies are going to go to North Korea, invest or anything, no, it's going to be nothing. So one of the other problems in Europe is that there is no interest anymore into North Korea. There is an interest from one of the schools. You know, in Europe, you could say, very, very caricature, but two schools. The strategic school that was focusing on North Korean nuclear and ballistic proliferation crisis, and the engagement school. Sometimes people being more regional experts, etc. For many years, you have kind of a balance. France being on the side, on the very, like strategic school. Sweden, if we take some extreme, on the other side of more engagement, regional perspective, etc. Right now, the strategic school, I would say, is winning over in Europe because the lack of engagement, because of the deterioration of relations, because North Korea getting closer to Russia, because of what's going on in Northeast Asia overall, etc., and the lack of engagement and interaction, we are dealing with North Korea from an even more non-proliferation perspective than 4 or 5 years ago. Second, there is fewer countries in Europe now that have an interest in engaging with North Korea. Many Central and Eastern European countries that were used to engage with North Korea, because of the rapprochement with Russia and the war in Ukraine that is conducted by Russia, we think twice before engaging with North Korea. So it left us with the Nordic, and there's been a lot of change over the last few years, especially from Sweden, etc., but I will let, of course, more qualified people to discuss it. So we are in a situation in which North Korea is reopening, the Europeans have little interest in engaging, and even if you put North Korea in broader perspective, like North Korea is an Indo-Pacific country, when we discuss Indo-Pacific, we never talk about North Korea. That's the reality. North Korea is not even mentioned in the European strategy for the Indo-Pacific. And this is, in a way, a bit too outside of the key scope of the Indo-Pacific. So I'm kind of pessimistic in the willingness and the appetite of European leaders be it at the European level, be it at the nation state and member state level, to engage with North Korea. You take the French president, doesn't care much about North Korea, except because this is a proliferation crisis. So the idea that he's going to push, and the French government is going to push for engagements, what they didn't do 5 years ago, when we could have, when there were international negotiations, is not going to happen anytime soon. So to conclude, because I don't know how much time I've spoken already, some of the leverage we had actually a few years ago before the pandemic in 2020, and I wrote back then a very long paper for CIPRI, but it was for the European Commission on what could be done in North Korea, was to revive some EU-North Korea political dialogue that ceased to exist in 2015. That's something that could be possible, but once again, it won't be the priority on the EU level. There is a need yet to keep working on North Korea, and we need to make sure that there are more hearings on North Korea within the European Parliament, be it at the Foreign Affairs Committee, be it at the Subcommittee on Security and Defense, at the Human Rights Committee, be it, of course, at the Delegation for Relations with the Korean Peninsula. We need to keep North Korea on the agenda. This is hard, but we need to make sure it's still on the agenda. This is why the French with the Korean organized in August in Vienna, during the PrepCom of the NPT, an event on North Korea. Not to solve the issue, we're not naive, but to make sure it remains on the agenda. Then we need to make sure at the European level that there is still a source of analysis and autonomous evaluation of what's going on in North Korea, and we are losing it. We don't have a new generation of European experts on North Korea. We rely a lot on the information coming from the US and coming from South Korea. I'm not saying that we don't trust what's coming from Washington and Seoul, but we need our own autonomous capacity to analyze, evaluate, and make decisions. We don't have them. Our intelligence are not focusing primarily, for sure, on North Korea. The other leverage we had before was to facilitate international negotiation and increase understanding. But on international negotiation, same, not going to be anytime soon some high-level talk between North Korea and the US on denuclearization, or at least nothing that in the coming weeks or coming months, and the role that some Europeans played before, like Sweden and else, might no longer be needed anymore. One of the countries that could still play a role, but not on strategic issues, but more on overall issues, is more Switzerland. That has never been the key country to talk about denuclearization per se and to host talks, but to talk about more comprehensive issues. And the Swiss, be it on humanitarian issues or else, could still play a role that other EU member states or that some member states do not play anymore. Just to conclude on one issue in which we could try to engage, and we discuss it a bit later, that on the humanitarian issue. The humanitarian situation in North Korea now is worse, way worse than it was 4 years ago. And Kim Jong-un himself acknowledged it in terms of food security. But we have many more worried, concerned, including about the health situation in North Korea. Something that were being discussed before the pandemic in 2020, like making sure there is no funding gap in UN activities in North Korea. There were back in 2019, I think 70 million left in terms of funding for the food security of the WFP. We could address these issues. Another one would be to make sure that the global fund, to fight HIV, malaria, and tuberculosis, could be well directed toward North Korea, because we are after a pandemic. That's why North Korea closed, and for other reasons for 4 years. That could be one issue. But just to conclude, another one could be to discuss, and I wrote something about that 2 years ago, because it was something that North Korea asked for, and they came to us to discuss it. Is the issue of better prepare and respond to natural disasters, basically to help them design a better crisis management mechanism, be to face natural disaster or epidemics. That's two issues in which the North Korea unofficially came to us. I know in France, it was the case in Germany, it might have been the case in other EU member states, to discuss. I know once again that this is not the priority, but that could be one way to restore some form of communication channels that we lost over the last 4 years, and that could be a realistic yet very soft way to re-engage on the European side with North Korea in a way that would not be vetoed by some EU member states. And I'm thinking of France, because France did veto many initiatives many years ago, and we need to be realistic on that, but also Germany and others. So I will stop here and, of course, engage for more discussion after.
Thank you. very sobering presentation, but many would say very realistic presentation actually, and I think that's the feeling you get across many European capitals for sure. Jim, let's move on to you.
It's also taken the guts out of what I was going to say. I was 10 days ago, I was on a boat in the south of France, and I received an email from John saying, would I take part in this seminar? Well, the cruise was going on for another 4 or 5 days. We came back, we had painters in. We have problems in our house trying to sort out papers at the moment. So I've gone back to something I wrote back in about 10 years ago, or slightly less than 10 years ago, for a conference, a similar conference, organized by the Korean Institute for National Unification in Madrid, which again was on exactly the same theme. And I then said that while South Koreans talked about unification and talked about as though it was going to happen, the reality was that there are many divided states, or what were once states in the world, that have never reunited. In a sense, I come from one myself. My parents were Irish. I have Irish citizenship as well as British. And Ireland, which was a united province of Britain and was united right up until 1921, has remained divided ever since, despite the wishes of many, not all, but many, to see unification. German unification, yes, the two Germanys came together. Germany was only united in 1871 in its modern form, and the reunification brought together East and West Germany. But it didn't bring together the greater German nation, which had once existed. Up until the end of the 18th century, the greater German nation, the most powerful unit in it was Austria. And there was a brief period under the Nazis when Austria was part of Germany again, but that unification, I think, is now finished. There will never be, that I can see, a united Germany, including Austria, because the Austrians don't want it. They've developed a separate entity. And so one could go on. There are lots of countries that have been divided and remain divided. Even some of countries that have been reunited, the divisions are still there. If you go to Germany, you can still see the differences between East and West Germany. In East Germany, the medical system is different. It's still more socialist-based than that in West Germany. The East German unions are much more strong than the West German unions, a hangover from communist days. So if there's a rail strike, as hit us once a few years back, East German railways close down. West German railways continue to function. So united, but not united. And one can go on. Now, the complication, Germany was not divided by a civil war. Korea was divided by, well, first of all, the initial decision to divide for surrender purposes in 1945, but that division was intensified and made far worse by the Korean War. And the Korean War, although it was an international war, was also a civil war. And civil wars are the devil to eradicate. If you look at the United States, which fought a civil war in the 1860s, the reunification took place, but you can still trace the divisions. Go south of the old Mason-Dixon line, the division between North and South, and you'll see Confederate flags still flown. You'll see Confederate slogans still up. Some states have taken down the Confederate flag, but it is still everywhere. And one of the themes that Mr. Trump plays on is the Confederacy and the states' rights and those sort of things. The American Civil War lingers on. Spain, a divided country. Divided, but the tensions and the problems that arose from the 1936-39 Civil War are still present in Spain. They're less strong than they were, but they're still there. So just because there was once unification on the Korean Peninsula doesn't mean to say there will be again. I'm sorry to say that to our Korean friends. And that despite the fact that Korea enjoyed 1,000 years of unification. But before that 1,000 years of unification, it was also a divided set of peoples. They spoke similar languages, spoke the same language perhaps. They had similar customs, but they were not a united political entity. So to me, there is no guarantee that that political entity can be recreated. It might be, but the divisions have now lasted so long that several generations have grown up knowing not a unified. There's probably nobody now alive who remembers a united Korea, maybe one or two very, very elderly people who were children at the time of the division. There's certainly nobody who remembers an independent Korea, because that was ended in 1910. So while I can understand why Koreans talk about unification, I personally see it as a very difficult thing to do. And I think it would be better to aim for something less rather than something, the whole picture. If you could get to the state where you could have two states that fully recognized each other, fully accepted each other's existence, and lived side by side, maybe worked together on all sorts of things, that would be progress. And that might be possible, but the unification project, I think, is dead in the water. And it's dead in the water, as it's been shown. I mean, in my time involvement with Korea, my first involvement with Korea began in about 1972, 73. It was a time of hope. There'd been first of all the Red Cross talks, and then the government-to-government talks, and then it all fell apart. I was posted there when Kim Jong-un was president of South Korea. And although there was the terrible incident of the Rangoon bombing, a few months later, almost within the same year, Chun responded positively to a North Korean offer of aid when there were severe floods in the south. And for a moment again, hopes were raised, but it petered out. No Tae-woo tried. Every single president since Park Chung-hee has tried to engage with North Korea, and each one has been disappointed. I think there is a lesson there, that perhaps stop trying to engage in the way you have been doing in the past, try and engage in a very different way. Accept the existence of a separate state, and it might well continue long into the future. Possibly one day, Korea will be reunited. There are good elements there as well. You will speak the same language. People say, oh, well, North Koreans speak a different language. There's a few differences, but I've never yet met two North Korean officials who couldn't talk to two South Korean officials. I've never heard any problems there. When I was there were South Koreans coming to North Korea. You would meet them occasionally in the lifts and in the hotels and things like that. They didn't seem to have any communications problems. So yes, language helps to unite. Geography helps to unite. It's a peninsula. It has a big neighbor to the north. That also helps you to unite as well. But historically, there is a tradition of a unified peninsula. None of those things are actually a guarantee that that will continue. So again, it's a question of being realistic. And then turning to Europe, my colleague here has really set out the doubts that must exist about whether Europe really would be much involved in North Korea. It obviously thinks there are lessons to be learned from German unification. There are lessons to be learned perhaps from the Irish case and the Good Friday Agreement and things that flowed from that. But that, of course, touches on another issue, that the mistake is to see yourselves, South Koreans, going into the north and dominating the north. Because if you do that, you will get a unified entity, but you won't get a unified Korea. You've got to draw back from the desire for revenge the desire for redress for the Korean War and for the provocations that the North Koreans have done over the years, if you want unification. But as I say, I don't think that's very likely. Europe is, 2 minutes, right? I'll be very quick. Europe, as it's been said, is very distant from North Korea, not just physically, but also in terms of its involvement with Korea. The principal players are always going to be the near powers: China, Japan, the United States, to a certain extent possibly Russia, and the two Koreas themselves. Anything else is pie in the sky. A little aid perhaps, but nothing like the massive aid after the Korean War to South Korea. But do not pin your hopes on a European man on a white horse riding to the rescue. You've got to do it yourselves, you Koreans, not outsiders. Thank you.
Thank you. And thanks for the historical perspective as well. Very good to bring it to the table. Niklas, you're next.
Sure. Of course, I have to be optimistic as a Swede. No, I will not be, unfortunately. But in some aspects, I am optimistic. In what we have experienced is absolutely no lack of willingness to engage from the North Koreans. Even during the pandemic, we've been running a number of projects, joint research projects, different forms of engagement. They always pick up the phone in Pyongyang. So there is that willingness to really engage. The problem I see, and that ties very much into the disinterest of Europe, is the lack of funding. And we talked about that also in the morning. There's absolutely, I wouldn't say there's no interest, but there's a limited interest in Europe to actually fund these activities. And then there's the expectations. And I don't think there's a future for denuclearization. I do share your view that we should not recognize them, but I think we have to be realistic about this. I do share the skepticism of unification. It doesn't mean we shouldn't engage them. Sanctions do not work. We have Russia and China make sure that that happens. Of course, this is painful, but it's not going to bring them to an end. We should not lift sanctions because we have sanctions for reasons. It's also important to realize that sanctions is not only due to the nuclear issue. There's also criminal sanctions. There's unilateral, there's multilateral. So when we talk about sanctions and all that, it doesn't work, but they're going to remain. So we need to find a way to engage. And this is where I am optimistic. And sometimes we need to engage for engagement only. And having that sort of more realistic expectations. And here, I agree with Ambassador. Language is extremely important. You can frame things in a way that you can engage the North Koreans, and I'll come back to that, on issues that they refuse to engage on. But they tend to be very sort of... So, that said, what can the Nordics do? And I'm going to look at that and maybe also look at the NGO alternatives. There is a lack of engagement generally. Sweden, though, has nominated a new special representative for North Korea. We had a few weeks of very intensive negotiations that resulted in that we have a G.I. Joe handover. So the Swedes are there. Let's be honest on that one. But for me, there's sometimes some very high expectations from both the Korean capitals as well as United States and the Nordics. But I think we have to be a bit realistic what we can do. And I think that we can look at, as what Sweden have done. And I'm not really going to comment on anything that have happened. If there are any questions about, actual what they did, refer the questions to the Swedish Foreign Ministry. But Nordics can offer as a go-between, and I think especially Sweden and Finland, and I think Finland especially has been very underestimated. it's not a resolution of a conflict. This is about humanitarian aid. This is about smaller issues. And we have to be clear, and I think this is a bit misunderstood from some people, especially in Asia. Sweden and the Nordics, we follow, well, not Norway then, but we follow European Union format. We are a bit more liberal than the rest, and there are others who are more conservative, but we still play in the same field. So EU has a policy of critical engagement. The Nordics follow, but it's not a political priority. I think we have to be realistic about that, even for the Nordics. Take Sweden as an example, Ukraine. I mean, our concerns are Ukraine, 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 and then we have NATO. And then we might have a few more issues, but North Korea is not on top of that. The good thing is United States. Of course, that everything that Sweden does right now involves United States, be that Ukraine or NATO. And if United States has an issue that needs to be have assistance with, that works well. And I think that's really what the good offices in a neutral platform is. Sweden is the only Western country that has an unbroken diplomatic representation in Pyongyang since '73. We have the protective mission, neutral nations, supervisory commissions in '53. So there is a presence. But as Jim said, not even the Swedes are coming in on a white horse. We might try to ride in on an elk, but it's not going to work. But I think we have to have much more realistic expectations. And there are limitations what a country like Sweden can do. It's not our focus. We tend to be very bureaucratic and slow, especially compared to what maybe Seoul would like to do. I think that the Nordics can actually provide sort of a official, non-official channels to provide a sort of long-term stable relations. And of course, I say between the Koreas, but even more importantly, between the United States and North Korea. And I think that this has been maybe a bit of a problem. From my point of view, we need to put the South Koreans in the driving seat, because in the end of the day, that's the only country, well, apart from North Korea, that is a day-to-day national security concern. But I do find it also really important to find that engagement on different levels. And here is what we've been talking to the North Koreans about. And I say Nordic multilateralism, or maybe Finnish, the Helsinki process. And I think that we should be clear that the North Koreans refuses anything that resembles the Helsinki process, because that leads to the demise of the Soviet Union. So in our discussions with the North Koreans, we came up with the Arirang process. And they're fine with that language. And so what we're looking at is rice balls or balls. Of course, which is very different from baskets. And we were trying to look at how you can engage. And what we're looking at is official communication, 1.5, 2.0, direct engagement, international engagement, multilateral engagement, or even indirect engagement. So what we have done during the pandemic is we have had dialogues with the North Koreans. Another party has had dialogue with us, and we have acted as sharing information. And that is feasible, because then you have no direct communication except with an NGO in Sweden. So what we are looking at is to build a process where you can jump between that sort of official engagement and a more unofficial, a more direct and a more indirect process. And what we have done is to look at a couple of low-hanging fruit. One is gender, which we actually were able to get a South Korea-North Korean exchange, which worked really well. We're looking at climate change, water issues. Of course, we're looking at natural disasters. All of that, of course, can be transferred into something more concrete. The North Koreans have no problem engaging in that. We also deal with societal issues. And if you want to translate that into human rights, you can do that. But social security, social stability is another way of saying it. What we don't really do is denuclearization. What we look at is nuclear control. We look at global denuclearization, which is not an issue for North Korea. They're happy to deal with that. So this is the way we're trying to deal with it. And finding that sort of a Korean-style process of engagement is possible. But short-term, mid-term, I think we have to be extremely realistic about the expectations. Long-term, maybe even so. But what we're looking at least that form of engagement that I think the Nordics can provide. And actually, I think a lot of the Europeans can provide that as well. I don't see a problem for the UK or Spain or France, Italy to engage, because we have that process. We are not that important. We're not that intrusive. And I think that that's where it actually can play a role. But the limitations is we have no interest. And in the sense that we need to put the South Koreans and the North Koreans in a driving seat, or else we're not going to reach anywhere. And thank you for the extra minute.
Thank you also for a very realistic assessment and also bringing the US factor, South Korea factor into Europe as well, into European policy. And now we have the final presentation before we move to the Q&A. So Antonio, the floor is yours. Are you coming here? Okay.
I just have 4 slides, so actually. Even though I'm absolutely convinced of the fact that actually the last panelist of the last panel should have at least 25 minutes. But, I honestly think that Ramon actually has a different idea. All right, thank you very much. And thanks actually to John, to the organizers, to the ministry, and to all of you for being here today. And of course, thank you for the invitation. Well, actually, when I was invited, I received this email, and at a certain point, I was told that I should participate to this conference, and I was included in the 3rd panel, whose title was something like Cooperation with European States for Korean Unification. In that sentence, actually, I could not understand 2 words: cooperation with European states and unification. So actually, I was pretty much puzzled. But in any case, because I don't believe actually, as many of the panelists have already underlined that at this point any kind of cooperation with any European state exists. Of course, actually, I prepared something in order to give some policy recommendations, and it goes without saying that eventually I don't see any kind of unification coming very soon. But in any case, actually, what I did is eventually trying to, in the first 2 slides, actually trying to make you understand, and of course, actually, Ambassador Everard or Jim or many other people here know, this process much better than I do. But actually, in the first 2 slides, actually, what I did The first one is, I tried to rebuild eventually what was the period of Europe's active engagement, because there has been a period of active engagement of Europe, and that basically coincided with, the mid-90s. Eventually, some think that actually this was somewhat to be connected to, Kim Jong-un's sunshine policy. But eventually, when we talk about the active engagement, of course, there were reasons behind that. Many of the reasons were, a few of the reasons actually were, the famine that actually occurred in North Korea in the 90s. And of course, they needed help, they needed to be supported. The fact that actually there was a specific organization, that was named KEDO, of which actually Europe was kind of one of the protagonists, and of course, actually, these shaped the participation to KEDO. Actually, shaped this kind of new international role of the European Union, and that basically was pretty much important in order to stabilize the situation on the Korean Peninsula, and eventually that could have also helped us, to support. To stop actually this nuclear proliferation. And so, at that time, there was, this active engagement, there was a kind of integration, the effort that actually the European Union did in order to integrate the DPRK within the international community. There was some kind of diplomatic engagement. Actually, if you do look at, the European Commission memo on the relations with South Korea, there's also a specific section that actually was devoted to support to inter-Korean reconciliation process, something that, basically we don't take into account anymore nowadays. So socializing North Korea was a very, very important, factor for the European Union at that time. I come from Italy, and actually Italy was a pioneer. Luckily, actually what we did was really good for my country, and actually for as an effort in order to to reconnect the two Koreas, because actually Italy was the first country within the G7 to create this kind of memorandum of understanding with North Korea. And actually we also had with Lamberto Dini, Minister of Foreign Affairs, actually we created, an office in Pyongyang. So actually ambassadors who were nominated by our president actually had to give credentials in the hands of South Korean's president, but then actually the next step was going to North Korea to give the same credentials in the hands of North Korean authorities. So actually this was pretty much positive in our interaction, in Europe interaction with both of Koreas. But then actually there was a disengagement. That was the moment of active engagement. Then actually disengagement came. And, what I think is that basically, disengagement came with, along with the second nuclear crisis. That was a moment when actually something happened, and of course that was the responsibility of North Korea. I'm not saying that it was not that. What we actually, the difference between the first and the second moment was, according to me at least, was that in the first moment, in the first phase, when we actively engaged North Korea and South Korea, actually Europe was pretty much independent from the position of the United States. When actually the disengagement started, that also started because eventually Europe followed the United States in becoming more severe in condemning actually the posture of North Korea. And, of course, nothing new actually happened with Trump. Basically, Europeans followed the coercive diplomacy that was implemented by the Trump administration. And this is actually specifically what I would like to pay attention to. Is there a significant role for Europe nowadays? Because this is, you know, actually pretty much important, and many things have already been said by my colleagues, actually. First of all, what kind of Europe are we looking at? Because actually, I don't think that, you know, I would say, you know, European minor states, let's say, or less important states, less relevant states actually have nothing, you know, that have any possibility to eventually participate in these kind of scenario. Okay, so actually, when it comes to me, the only you know, European institutions that eventually can play a significant role in Korea and between the two Koreas are, you know, the European External Action Service, or, you know, France and Germany as UNSC members, or eventually Germany specifically, because it's probably the core, even the economic core of Europe, and eventually Sweden, for all the reasons that Niklas has already mentioned. Are we actually, all right, are we actually, can we actually lead? Can we play a leading role in the Korean Peninsula? If we actually look at what has happened in the past, I don't think we can. I mean, you know, we were excluded. Europeans were excluded by the six-party talks, and eventually from any kind of diplomatic, you know, dialogue between Seoul and Pyongyang, between Pyongyang and Washington, between Washington and Seoul. So I don't see, you know, what kind of leading role Europeans can eventually play. Do we actually have the desire to assume a leading role? Well, again, if we look at our experiences, actually, you know, we were, as I said, we were part of the KEDO, and after that we participated in that experiences, but that basically brought to any kind of political influence for Europe. We participated to that, but actually we remained with empty ends, basically. But I also think that actually, I mean, it's pretty much important for Europeans not to think that actually we should not participate in these specific issue, okay, in the Korean issue, because it's pretty much relevant for us to participate in these. And actually, you know, I think that what Europe can do is, you know, playing a secondary but significant role. But, you know, when it comes to the secondary role, actually, we also need to look at what kind of specific secondary role Europe can play. And, you know, give me 1 minute more, if you can, to just to explain these.
35 seconds, more or less?
Okay, give me 1 minute 35 seconds, please. Please, Ramon, come on, we're friends. So actually, what I'm telling you is that, you know, we can eventually be facilitators when it comes to negotiations. So facilitating negotiations, because, you know, paradoxically as it may seem, actually I was totally in line with what Ambassador Everard said this morning. So we have this track of past diplomatic relations, very strong, and we are Europeans, only Europeans actually have this kind of track. I mean, with North Korea, actually, we are less threatening than the United States. When North Koreans look at us, actually, we, for whatever reason, actually seem less threatening than the US. And of course, we have experience in these kind of processes. Look at, you know, Iran, actually. We have that kind of experience. Or we can go back to active engagement. if at some point the nuclear issue is solved, I'm not saying it will be, but if it at some point is solved, actually we can act as guarantors of any agreement that eventually can be signed between South Korea and North Korea, or between the two Koreas and any other actor in the international community, or increasing activism. Specific case of a possible military confrontation, actually we can persuade people that this specific case can have devastating consequences. So we actually can tell them that we should not get up to that point. And then of course I have policy recommendations, but I am forbidden. I am forbidden actually, so I will stop here. Thanks. Thanks a lot. That's right.
I want to refer to everyone.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thanks for that.
Thanks.
So you can read them. It's good that you mentioned the 6 party talks, because that was a very sobering experience for Europe, as you said, right? We were excluded from the process. And many Europeans felt, after Kido that you mentioned, right? After pain in Kido, now we're excluded from the main negotiations with North Korea. So thanks for reminding us of that. We will go straight to the Q&A. I think I'll open it to the public, because I already see a couple of hands, so we can already collect 2 questions. I think you still have to introduce yourself. Sorry. Why don't we collect these 3 questions on the right-hand side first?
A couple of points. Firstly, Ramon, I was excluded from the 6 party talks up to a point, Your Honour. As I recall, Jim was probably closer to this than I was, what happened was that at the end of Kido, the European Union was still smarting under the amount of money that this had cost. Building light water reactors is not cheap. And it was apparent that if the 6 party talks had succeeded, we all know that the history went the other way, that those participating were going to be landed with very large bills. And there was a distinct lack of enthusiasm in European capitals and in Brussels to get back on the boat. I think there was a feeling that if the Americans, Japanese wanted to do this, that's fine. Second, Jim, the point you made about getting to a stage where you've got 2 states that recognise each other. I always feel that Korea doesn't study closely enough the Central American experience in this. The Central Americans have for decades now been trying to integrate. There's an organisation whose Spanish name translates as the Central American Integration System. Now, as you can see from any map, Central America is still divided into a series of quite small states. But they have achieved a great deal. You have relative freedom of movement throughout most of the area, freedom of capital movement. It's not quite the European Union, but it's getting there. These things, there's low-hanging fruit that I think the 2 Koreas could probably grasp short of full unification. Thank you.
Thank you. Teresa, let's go straight to you.
Teresa?
Hello, Teresa Novotna. Great panel. I would have lots of questions, but maybe if I may ask Niklas 3 short ones, which were inspired by your presentation. So first of all, you mentioned all the online meetings you had with the North Koreans throughout the pandemic. Are you going to continue with, in this kind of engagement? And do you have a feeling that maybe the North Koreans now prefer actually to engage online rather than face-to-face, because obviously they can control this a little bit better? So that would be one question. And then second question, in terms of the Finland and Sweden joining the NATO, have you had any discussions with the North Koreans about that, and do they sort of feel now that they are that you are now getting closer to the imperialist United States than you used to be as a neutral state? And lastly, can you give us any insights on the negotiations over Travis King, if you have any? Thank you.
I have another question right behind.
Thank you very much. I'm Brendan Sims. I'm the director of the Centre for Geopolitics. I know nothing about Korea. I'm I work on Germany and Europe, but I've learned a great deal just listening this part of the afternoon. There were two parallels mentioned. One was Ireland. Of course, Ireland isn't so much a province as a nation. So actually, the difference I would see to Germany and Korea is actually the division within a nation. In the German case, the German Democratic Republic, as you know, the communist side of Germany, they actually they started out by seeing themselves as part of the wider German nation and looking for reunification on their terms, as permitted by the Soviet Union. But actually, intellectually, towards the end, they began to develop the idea of two German nations. And so my question is, and it comes from a position of complete ignorance, on the North Korean side, how are they articulating this? Are they, which seemed to be the implication of what Professor Park was talking about, really saying that, well, there is one Korean nation and we're going to take it over, or do they also see, would they be beginning at some point to be talking about North Korea as actually a separate nation, which might be a straw in the wind of how they see this unfolding? So that's my question.
Thank you. So we have questions for everyone. I think there is one on the six-party talks and Europe's position. So, I mean, Antonio, Jim, Antoine, you also know about this topic. One of them about the example of Central America, potential example for Korea. I think that was for Jim. And then, Nicholas, you had a question about online meetings, North Koreans' feelings about Finland, plus Sweden, of course, joining NATO, and then any insights on the Travis King negotiations. That would be very interesting. You're on the record, remember? And finally, the example of the two Germanys. I think, Professor Pak, that was for you. So, Antonio, why don't we begin with you and we go in reverse order with this first round of questions?
I actually, I don't know, actually. Ambassador Everard actually has made history. I have studied history, so actually we have two different perspectives. As if he tells me that, actually, I'm sorry.
I've done both. Studied and made.
I mean, I do absolutely trust him when he tells me, something about the six-party talks. As far as I know, actually, in any public document, ever prepared by the Kedo or South Koreans I have ever read, but I might be wrong. John, believe me, actually, forgive me. I have ever read that the European Union was taken into any kind of consideration as an integral part of the six-party talks.
I think that's absolutely right. I don't think we were ever involved at all. There was no intention whatsoever by the United States to let Europe be involved, except to pay. That was except to pay.
That's all. Ramon, I've been very quick, actually.
No, I'm so sorry.
If I can just develop, if I may, develop a point about the United States. One of the great problems of the United States is that the agreed framework wasn't actually implemented fully. And I don't mean on the uranium side. The United States and the North Korea had agreed to exchange liaison officers. Neither of them pursued that. That was a great and utter mistake. If the United States had been present on the ground in North Korea, if they'd had the offices that we had, which were originally intended for them, they might have begun to understand much more realistically what North Korea was about and why North Korea was about. And that might have opened a few eyes. There were American officials who did have that sense, but none of them ever actually lived or worked in North Korea. I was always horrified to hear Victor Cha say how he'd spent one night in North Korea and he'd been absolutely terrified that they were going to kidnap him, which didn't show much understanding of North Korea. But if they'd been there, it would have made a huge difference. I don't know whether it wouldn't have solved the problems, but it would have given them an understanding that they've never had otherwise. That's my sixpenny worth on that issue.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Niklas, we had
Well, I leave the
questions for you.
negotiations that the Swedish Foreign Minister involved to the Swedish Foreign Minister. It doesn't matter if I'm guessing or what. If I would say anything, even if I would just guess out of thin air, somebody would pick it up. Finland, Sweden, and NATO, we actually asked the question to the North Koreans. And, I mean, we are the lackeys of the devil anyway. We all belong to the CIA, I assume, everybody in this room. But they're fine with it. So they don't see a big change really going in. The big problem is Russia. That Sweden has been very critical of Russia. It's striking that I've been criticized by the North Koreans, not for criticizing North Korea, but for criticizing Russia of their invasion of Ukraine. So it is more the relations towards Russia that is problematic than NATO. And of course, they tell you all the time that this is bad, this is putting a... But when you talk to them individually, they sort of say that, no, it's not NATO, it's your relations. The online meetings, it's not a preference. The thing is, if a North Korean participant would sometimes just participate by being present, they really don't want to say much, because if they say something, they're on record. If you engage in a, let's say they come as guest researchers to us, which we have a couple of every year, or they participate in a workshop, you always have that question of interpretation. What did you say? What did you not say? If you're online, well, they tape, of course. I mean, there's so much, yeah, it became so much official that it can be. So I think we will see more engagement with the North Koreans when they want to deliver official messages. Then they can do it online. But if there's going to be any substance in the meeting and maybe explore avenues, no. I think they avoid it. I mean, I hate online meetings, but they're terrified of them for good reasons, And I'll leave it at that.
Jim, do you want to take the question on Central America as a potential example for the Koreas, or?
Well, John knows much more about it than I do. I mean, I think Korea, yes, there are lots of examples of cooperation and so on in the world, but it's getting the two Koreas to talk is the thing. Getting them to accept that each exists and is there. Now, on that point, the point about what is the North Korean position? The North Korean position is very clear. We are the legitimate we are the legitimate Korean state, and all people in the South are longing to be unified under, well, in my day it was Kim Jong-un. And you say to them, I don't think that's true, and they just ignore you. That's what they believe, that's the official line. They're not going to deviate from that publicly.
Yeah, very briefly, on the online meeting, one of the problems we may face as well is that, I don't know for you, but North Korea, especially the MFA, when you want to do online meeting with them, is asking to get some money to pay for the technical aspect of it. Might be 500 euros, in itself is nothing. But if you find a way to send 500 euros to North Korea from Europe, you violate international sanctions. And that's something that the panel of experts of the UN is inquiring right now, this kind of online meeting, if there is money being transferred. So that complicates a lot this kind of discussion, if, once again, they ask to some technical support to
They can always use the embassies.
Sorry?
They can use the Western embassies. They have no staff there.
Yeah. Second aspect is, I mean, I don't want to be pessimistic, but let's be realistic of the role and what the EU can do. Look at the periphery of the EU right now. Ukraine, what was going on and still going on in Syria, what's going on in Niger, all over Sahel, in between Armenia and Azerbaijan in Karabakh, etc. The idea that the EU is the key driving force in the world to prevent crisis and solve crisis, I'm sorry, but if we still believe that in Europe, we are not noticing what's going on. So the idea that we will play a key role to avoid a crisis between North and South Korea, it's good for you if you believe in it, but don't believe in us too much, because we won't be the key actor. Let's be very realistic on that. If we have an interest in minimizing tension, of course. Can we play that role? That's another question. And on that, the EU's, and the way North Korea have seen the EU's for many years, has always been at the piggy bank. So just like you say for the US, etc. Will the EU, I mean, if we are offered to be part of 7 party talks, I'm not even sure the EU would join them. First, because you need to have a balance, and that the whole idea of the 6 party talks, were 3 and 3 and stuff, if you add the EU, who else do you add on the North Korean side? Because we are on the US side. Because from the North Korean perspective, we have seen on the US side, because we are one of the only political entity to adopt unilateral sanctions against North Korea, just like the US, South Korea, or Japan does. So we are not at all being seen as neutral from the North Korean perspective. It's different from some EU member states, like Sweden. Not that Sweden is neutral, but because Sweden, of course, has that very specific relationship with the US, Sweden is important. And Switzerland is another issue. But I would say that other countries could play a role. Vietnam did in 2018, Vietnam did in 2019, Singapore did in 2018, Mongolia did before. This year in the Ulaanbaatar dialogue, defense dialogue, there were no North Korean yet because the country had not reopened. I think next year in June 2024, there might be North Korean going to Ulaanbaatar in Mongolia. That could be an opportunity to interact if they don't come to Europe, for at least for us to have indirect discussion in Mongolia. And then the role of the EU to pay. Once again, let's check how much money of the last 10 years South Korea provided to North Korea in terms of humanitarian aid. And let's compare it to what the Europeans have done, even though we are far away and do not care much about what's going on in North Korea, because our priority is Africa, is the Middle East, was everything was happening in Yemen, in Somalia, and everywhere close to Europe, and of course Ukraine now. The Europeans have still provided a lot of money. It's not massive, but still. And it was basically the EU providing 45% of it, then Sweden, 18 to 20%, Germany, 15%, France, 10%, even if we have seen as a very hawkish country, we were provided 10% of the whole European aid. And that's something we can do. So it's a bit a paradox, I would say, a contradiction that the Europeans have a limited role. At the same time, we do play a key role in humanitarian assistance. That's something we could do and keep doing. But I'm, once again, a bit pessimistic on the actual role that the European can play in finding solutions and in being very useful in avoiding major crises in the Korean Peninsula.
I'll start with recommendations by 2 ambassadors whether the 2 Koreas should pursue a peaceful coexistence between the 2 countries. If there were a regional hegemon in Northeast Asia, the 2 Koreas would be reunited. And as far as there is a broad confrontation in Northeast Asia, the division would continue. And the Korean division is not one-to-one relations between South Korea and North Korea. Korea was divided because of Cold War geopolitical confrontation. And this geopolitical confrontation is still ongoing. And I suppose there is a competition, Sino-American competition. And this competition probably becomes worse. And probably in 10 or 20 years, we have the results of this competition. And if the American side would win, the Chinese side, Korea would be united by South Korea. If China would win the American side, then Korea would be united by North Korea. The competition between the two Koreas had not yet finished. This is still ongoing. And as far as the Korea is divided in 2 countries, and 2 countries with different ideologies, there would be very strong security competition between the two Koreas. And the peaceful coexistence between the two Koreas, I suppose, is an impossible dream because of ideological confrontation. And any country, look back the Korean history, the history of two Koreas. Until the 80s, many people in South Korea regard North Korea as a superior country in systemic terms. And many intellectuals turn toward North Korea. And nowadays, the relations has become reversed. There's a very strong magnetic attraction to South Korea in North Korea. Many North Korean people feel to be a part of South Korean country. And the most serious threat to North Korean security is not the military power of the U.S. American military power. The most grave threat, the most elementary threat to North Korean existence is rich and free South Korea. And in the 1990s, we waited 40 years after the Korean War, and we had a very good opportunity to revise the relations between the two Koreas in the 90s and 2000s. But we lost this opportunity. And North Korea tried to have security, and they endeavored with any cost in the last 30 years to become a nuclear power. And they achieved their purpose, achieved their target to become a nuclear power. And I suppose, actually, South Korea is in defensive nowadays towards North Korea. North Korea is in the offensive. And also, the global West was in the offensive from between 1980s to 2000s. And the global West became in defensive from 2010 till now. And the defense of global West is ongoing. As China and Russia has risen, and domestic constitution in Western countries is in crisis. And this crisis, probably to resolve this crisis, probably we need 10 or 20 years. And then probably the global West would have a chance to become superior to the other bloc. And then the liberal international order would become restored. If only the liberal international order will be restored, then can South Korea and North Korea could be reunited in peace and free and peaceful ways.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Thanks for that, and we do have time for a second round of questions. I see one hand here and one on the front as well. So we have two questions and one on the back, and we can then answer these three questions together.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I have two very brief questions. The first one is concerning the NGO's involvement. So, panelist Nicholas, you mentioned Sweden has approached North Korea on societal issues. Could you please elaborate a little bit on that? Because as far as I know, North Korea has been very sensitive and receptive to any forms of opinions on this. And the second,
on which subject?
Societal issue. Mm-hmm. And the second one is for the. So in North Korea's propaganda to develop nuclear weapons, to unify the Korean Peninsula and to support the King's region has been one united goal. How could, for panelist James, do you think it's possible for us to persuade North Korea to give up the hope for unification? And if so, can you think of any kind of approach to achieve this?
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Then here on the front.
Okay, I just want to know how Europeans think about Korean issues. First, I heard that the far-right political parties are on the rise in many European nations, and that I believe brings more nationalist sentiment as opposed to internationalist orientation. Would that sort of rightist-leaning political shift would further reduce Europeans' interest or attention to the Korean Peninsula issues? First question. Second question is regarding the geopolitics. The Russian invasion of Ukraine actually, showed us that, showed Europeans that what happens in Korea, what Koreans do, actually do affect on the security of Europeans. South Korea and North Korea are trying to, or actually are supplying arms, to the warring parties, and that war is very important issue in European security. So would that sort of connection between the fact that what happens in Korean Peninsula does affect the security of Europe would increase Europeans' sort of attention or interest in the peninsula issues.
Thank you. And we have one last question on the back. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Ha from the Dr. Chen at Cambridge. So thank you very much, first of all, for a very interesting, realistic as well as thought-provoking session. So I've got two questions. One is about Europe's overall the European role in Korean issues, and I'd like to bring the case of Southeast Asia. So I think over the recent more years, I think other than Malaysia, where Kim Jong-un was assassinated, all Southeast Asian member states do have diplomatic relationship with both Korea. We saw the two Trump-Kim summits happening in two Southeast Asian countries. So we see somewhat of an enhanced role in Southeast Asia nowadays that they're playing in these inter-Korea relations. So I guess my question is, what would be the European niche then that Europe can actually offer for these inter-Korean relations that regions like Southeast Asia cannot play? And the second question, so the first question is for anyone who can take it. The second question is for Dr. Swanstrom. To be more specific, I guess, I'd like to ask about the case of the Alex Sigley's or detention in North Korea when he was a student back at Kyungsung University in 2019. And Australian government reached out to the Swedish government, and that's when Swedish played a role to bring him out from North Korea back then. So what do you think such a niche that Sweden used to hold still exists today? And why do you think it was Sweden that could have played that role back then? That's it, thank you.
Okay, thank you. So I'll summarize the questions and then we can go to the answers. First one, there was one on NGOs' involvement in societal issues in North Korea. Niklas, that was for you. Then a question for the whole panel about can we convince North Korea that nuclear weapons for unification, reunification is not going to happen, so they should give up this dream. There was another one about European views of Korean issues and whether the rise of right-wing parties and nationalism means less interest for Europe's involvement in the Korean Peninsula, and differently, Russia's aggression of Ukraine, whether the threat of something happening in the Korean Peninsula and the effects for Europe can actually make Europeans more interested in Korean Peninsula issues. There was one on Southeast Asia's role in the Korean Peninsula and what niche is there for Europe, considering that Southeast Asia hosted the two summits between Trump and Kim. And the last one is for Niklas as well, another kidnapping case for you, Niklas. Alex Siglis in this case, or detention, not it's called kidnapping, and the role that Sweden play and where they can play the same role. Since we started a bit late, I think we can have 2 minutes or so for each of you. And we can go maybe in the order in which we started the panel. So, Professor Pak, there were several questions for the panel, so whichever you want to take on to answer. Yeah, if you go on to first, yeah, we're going in the same order. Yeah.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. He. There was question whether North Korea would like to develop a separate national identity, and I suppose during the Cold War, people thought that Cold War would be permanent, and there is no strong security relations between West and East Germany. The security relations, the security competition during the Cold War was between the United States and the Soviet Union in Europe, or between West Germany and Soviet Union. There is a very weak security competition between West Germany and East Germany. But in case of two Koreas, there have been very strong security competitions, and I suppose any country, South Korea or North Korea, could not sustain itself in unfavorable competitive position towards the other. So, the more North Korea's position relative to South Korea becomes unfavorable, the stronger North Korea will to unify. Because North Korea cannot exist as a state in unfavorable situation, unfavorable circumstance. So the more North Korea position becomes unfavorable, the stronger North Korea's will to unify, if possible, by force.
I will be very brief because then I need to catch the train to make sure to be back to Paris tonight. But very briefly on the NGO, because I can talk to you about the 2 French NGOs in North Korea. The only project they implemented related to societal issues were on vulnerable people, especially older people. That is something that is not always addressed in the North Korean system or well enough. So there are feedback on that, and some projects were actually funded by the Swedish government as well. So it's not because, the 4 European NGOs are being funded by a bit everyone. It's not because they are French that they got only French funding and vice versa. And the Swedish have no NGOs but fund the other NGOs, etc. So on elderly people and on women. And of course, how to better integrate women within the society, etc. But it's never being labeled as such in terms of humanitarian project. This is not what is being sold, I would say, to the North Korea. And it raises a big question, actually, for the 4 European NGOs, whether they can go back to North Korea, because it was very hard for them to operate. As you know, they are not labeled as NGOs. They are labeled as foreign entities, etc. They are not being handled by the NGOs office in the MOFA, etc. But they are not even sure that they can go back. So that's a big concern they have. Second, on the European connection, on the far right, etc. Honestly, the far right parties in Europe know nothing about Korea. They did not articulate anything about Asia. So honestly, I don't think there are any, actually, at least on the French side, any reasoning on North Korea or on Asia. Yet, if they might see it from a very security perspective, and they might still be interested on the non-proliferation issue, but what is possible that on the humanitarian level, they might be less interested than current parties. So I would not say a huge change, but maybe less interest on the humanitarian. And lastly, on the European niche, I think, once again, we need to make sure that on the implementation of sanction, even though sanction is not going to solve the issue, and no one believes in Europe, no French diplomat, no US diplomat, no British diplomat believe that the sanctions are going to solve and denuclearize. But there are signals that has been sent to the international community that international and the non-proliferation regime matter, and to deter other countries from doing so. And one of the big questions we're going to have in the coming years, and I think we need to really engage not with North Korea, with South Korea, is the scenario in which South Korea really try to get closer to the nuclear threshold. and reach the threshold. Because I know that in Europe for many years, people were like, no, come on, this is a joke. I mean, they will never do that. It's just to get in a better position with the US to negotiate more concession from the US. And I think it's a mistake to believe that it's only about that. And that's something that the Europeans with the South Koreans should discuss in a very straightforward way. I know that the South Korean perspective is that the Europeans and the US would never sanction South Korea because we needed you so much. And I think you're pretty right on that. But the big problem you might have is not from the US or from the EU, but from China. Because, of course, the Chinese would not accept it. And that's why I just conclude on the French very side. After AUKUS, there were some idea that the French could provide nuclear submarine to South Korea, etc. That's not something that's going to happen for one single reason. The Chinese, I would say, sanctions or the Chinese reaction would be massive. But once again, on the nuclearization of South Korea, that's something we should discuss a bit freely. And of course, the track 1 are not the right place to do so. The track 2, especially, and the track 1.5 might be.
Mm-hmm. Thanks for that. And Antoine has to go to take the train, so thanks for that.
I'm sorry, I got totally lost. There were too many questions, and I cannot now remember any of them. I'll just make one point, though, which doesn't relate to anything anybody said. Years ago, a well-known Korean scholar, biographer of Kim Il-sung, amongst other things, Soo Dae-sok, said at a conference we were running at Oxford, the other place at Oxford, that the problem with Korean unification was that for the whole period of the division, neither North or South Korea had ever put forward a proposal that could possibly be accepted by the other side. And that was a Korean speaking, that all proposals were bound to fail. And I think the situation still remains the same, that the two Koreas have not been able to project a possible solution to the division of the peninsula that is acceptable for one side or the other. So division will continue, I'm afraid. Sad though it may be.
Well, since I have you in detention, we'll start with the detention issue. I do think Sweden can still function as this. I mean, since '73, when Ambassador Cornell opened up the embassy, we have consistent contact. We have never shut down. This is appreciated by the North Koreans. This is why we started up a collaboration with the North Koreans in 2004. We have not shut it down, even if they have made nuclear tests, because we felt that the continuation was important. The North Koreans appreciate that. So there's a trust between the Swedes and the North Koreans. Then, of course, the North Koreans also know that there's trust between Swedes and the states that we have the protective mission with. So that enables Sweden to function as a go-between. So I think that will still exist. So if you take other states, the other states can do this as well. And I don't see a problem between Southeast Asia and Europe. Anyone who can do good things, you do good things. Whoever does it, I don't care. If the British embassy do good things, the Swedes won't care. And vice versa. Hopefully.
Don't worry. We don't do good things.
But when it comes to NGO involvement, we have never had an issue with the North Koreans. We can pretty much discuss what we want. We also have local cooperation with a couple of, and actually was said here by someone that, we focus too much on Pyongyang. That's true. So we have, and you get that access, but it comes, of course, we don't make everything public. We talk about societal security and water security, health, gender, all of this. But of course, we make sure that some of the publications we have, some of the discussions, it's not necessarily made public. It goes to sponsors and things like that. Then it was also mentioned here, I can't remember which one of the British diplomats who said it, but
we all speak the same.
But criticizing your own government. We bring up a lot of criticism to Sweden when it comes to social security, human rights. I mean, I come from one of the minority groups, the Sami population. There was forced sterilization in the 70s in Sweden. So of course we bring that up. Yeah. We talk about how we went through a rough period, what we have done, And the North Koreans, of course, say, yeah, well, we don't have that problem. And then eventually somebody comes and say, well, we don't really have the problem, but...
Yeah.
And eventually you start a discussion. That is so much worth, much more. And if you keep that profile, yeah, you can discuss these things. It's a question what you want to accomplish. Do you want a public event, or do you want information, you want a better understanding?
When they went on about imperialism...
We're really over time. So
Okay.
Let me give Antonio the last... We're over time because Roger's late, but Antonio, have the last word.
I just wanted to say something. When Professor Idongson actually asked about right-oriented governments, actually, for whatever reason, I'm the person. We don't have a right-oriented government. We have a fascist government nowadays in Italy. So actually, but let me tell you something. I used to work, with institutions in Italy. Okay, and up to let's say a couple of years ago, they asked me to produce reports on the situation on the peninsula, and that's what I did, because actually there were still somebody who was interested in knowing about what was happening in Korea. Okay, when I went to Rome, actually, when was it, a couple of months ago, and I brought them my last report, actually they said, well, no, I mean the current government is not really interested in Korea. If you can write something about the Belt and Road Initiative, that's what we do appreciate at the moment. So just to tell you.
So you were the one who destroyed the BRI.
Okay, on that note, if you can join me in thanking the panelists for an interesting discussion. Then we go now.
Ron, thank you for your expert sharing. Thank you for a very interesting panel. It's been a long but very interesting day and very illuminating. I just thought I'd say a few words in an effort to try and sum up our discussion. Antoine mentioned paradoxes, and in a way the whole day has been a bit paradoxical. We started on a relatively optimistic note, or at least I tried to set an optimistic note in terms of reflecting on the ambition of South Korea as a global pivotal state, the importance of the bilateral relationship between the UK and South Korea, and of course that very important state visit that we have to look forward to. And we heard from the Minister of Unification, what seemed to be a very clearly set out strategic vision for dealing with the DPRK. And just to remind you, he talked about the 3 Ds: deterrence, dissuasion, and dialogue. So in theory, it looks as if South Korea has a strategy for dealing with North Korea. We heard about South Korea's bold, audacious initiative, as well as this very clearly defined focus on human rights. So the South Koreans are certainly taking the North Korean issue seriously. But as we've heard this afternoon, and I think through all the panels, there is this underlying drumbeat of consistent pessimism. North Korea is not opening up, or if it is opening up, it's opening up very selectively and essentially aligning with authoritarian regimes. It's increasing its nuclear capabilities in a way that is extraordinarily worrying. It's led by a leader in the form of Kim Jong-un, who seems to have an appetite for taking risks and pushing the envelope of strategic stability on the peninsula. We also learned that the tools that we have to deal with this are quite inadequate. We heard from John Everard about the problem of sanctions, particularly European originating sanctions. They're not effective, they're not targeted, they're not enforceable, they're not consistent. And perhaps most importantly of all, in terms of the broader geopolitical context, we heard about what I would describe a process of sort of the crowding out of other global significant events, whether it's the challenge of a rising China, the war in the Ukraine, and as we've also heard, the tension within our own countries, the tension between populism and legitimate, open, transparent, democratic governments and the democratic processes associated with them. If that weren't enough of a reason to feel particularly pessimistic as we heard so eloquently from our North Korean refugee, the situation in the north is extraordinarily dire. The humanitarian situation for North Koreans, in light of what happened in the 1990s, but continues to happen, whether it's a result of a bankrupt economic system or the problems of natural disasters, the north is in a very powerless state. And as Jim said, I think very succinctly and appropriately, unification is dead in the water. So is there anything positive that we can take away from this pessimistic list of problems? Well, I would say there are a couple of things to think about. One is the recognition on the part of some of the players, South Korea through its GPS, but also the United States in light of the emphasis placed on trilateralism and trying to bring actors together. And maybe it's the very enormity of these problems that's making national governments, whether it's South Korea or Japan, recognize the importance of having solutions, but also keeping the United States engaged. And looking ahead to the next presidential election, this is surely an abiding concern. This may be one area where European countries might also play a role in trying to highlight the importance of America's leadership role. How can that be done? I'm not sure. But this might be an area where Europeans can think constructively together with their South Korean partners. The other perhaps positive, moderately positive point we could take away is that when we've talked about North Korea and South Korea, whatever the realities in the North, many observers have noted the ambition of North Korea, which in some ways parallels the ambition and optimism of South Korea. And maybe it's that ambition and that desire to succeed nationally that perhaps opens a glimmer of a door of optimism, which is the role of education, which we talked about already. There has to be some sort of long-term strategy for North Korea, in addition to building up its nuclear weapons, which is that of some form of economic development. But ultimately, again, to echo what was said this afternoon, it's going to be primarily down to the Koreans to come up with a solution, and that will require a great deal of long-term patience. In all of this, all of the reasons that I've outlined or repeated or emphasized from our discussion why we should be pessimistic also reminds us that we should think historically. And this again brings me back to earlier lessons and where Europe has played a role. If one thinks back to the Korean War, it was a British Prime Minister, Clement Attlee, who had to warn the Americans during the Eisenhower administration of the dangers of nuclear conflict, during the Truman administration rather, of nuclear conflict, in the face of General MacArthur's willingness to push the envelope in terms of strategic responses to North Korea. Perhaps it's up to Europeans to keep emphasizing that this situation on the peninsula needs to be taken seriously, even if there are no immediate solutions. We need to be conscious of the risks involved, and they are risks given the temperament of the North Korean leader and the real hardware that the North has. I don't, I'm afraid, have anything else to offer by way of optimism. I want to thank you all for your contributions. I want to thank our organisers, particularly from Korea University, the Ministry of Unification, my colleagues at the Centre for Geopolitics, Brendan Sims and Bill Hurst, and Darwin as well, the Master IC is back here. Thank you again for allowing us to use this space. All that remains for me to do is to end the conference and also end with one other announcement, which is for those who are amongst our speakers who are staying for dinner. There will be a dinner at 6 o'clock at the Garden House restaurant at the Graduate Hotel. I can't join you for that dinner, I'm afraid, because I have another engagement, but it's been a really fascinating and stimulating afternoon and morning, and thank you again for your attendance.